This session is a look at how SAGE will transform science and innovation in Australia. And I'm very pleased about this topic because, as I mentioned earlier on, I'm quite interested in innovation in Australia. And one of the key issues that I observed through my time as a journalist, and I'm observing now as a doctoral student, is the fact that we have different, dare we say, cultures. We've got academics, we've got industry, we've got politicians out there, and everybody needs to come to work together. And what's impressive about the group of people that are going to be talking to us next is that they have experience across all these, dare I say, domains. And the first person off the cab rank is Dr. Susan Pond, and she really is one of these people who can speak, having her feet in many, many parts of our society. She has an extremely distinguished record in academia, medicine, and industry. And she's the former vice president of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering and served as co-chair of the SAGE Pilot Steering Committee from 2015 to 2016. Excuse me, these are the people that did the really hard yards to get this whole program up and going. And she now serves on the SAGE Expert Advisory Committee and is yet another gonged Australian member of the Order of Australia, as well as the recipient of the Centenary Medal. And Susan is going to give us the background to the pilot and to Athena Swan. So please welcome Dr. Susan Pond.
Thanks very much. I should also say that I stand here as a mad career woman with 6 children and an even madder grandmother with 9 granddaughters, so I get more and more inspired. More and more inspired about STEM the older I get. And I can tell you, it's very hard to persuade 9 professional princesses, all of whom are under the age of 7, my granddaughters, to think about being professional women. And I had a disaster about 9 months ago when I ordered a whole lot of professional Barbies, entrepreneurs, astronauts, movie directors, and they went over like a lead balloon. But it is heartening that more than 300 of us have joined forces today with the same vision. And this vision is for equal representation of women and men in STEM disciplines, and as we've heard, that's 2 M's, maths and medicine. I represent both in our higher education and research organisations, including in leadership roles, which is the really important addition to that. Eventually, we know we need to rectify gender imbalance right across the STEM spectrum, in both directions. We do need more male kindergarten and primary school teachers, more male and female primary and secondary level teachers in STEM, more female high school students studying maths and physics, more male nurses, more females enrolling in engineering, physical sciences and computer science degrees. But today we're focusing on the higher education and research institutes of our country. And despite the fact that higher education enrolments by gender in Australia reached parity in 1988, almost 20 years ago, the percentage of women gaining the rank of full professors in most faculties, particularly in STEM, remains below 20% and is not increasing. That's why we're here today. Let's take the University of Sydney figures as an example, but by no means an outlier. In 2014, all but 3 STEM faculties, that includes the second M, had less than 25% women at level E, professor or equivalent. The only exceptions were health sciences, pharmacy and nursing. These figures have not improved compared to 2008. In some faculties, the figures have gone backwards. Why does this gender imbalance matter? It matters because the Australian higher education and research sectors are leaking female talent, wasting some of their best people, failing to benefit from the additional range of perspectives and backgrounds they would bring to the table, and losing the opportunity to perform better, all of which we've heard today from Elizabeth Broderick. It matters also because gender equality is a moral and business imperative, and it matters because of this newest bright shiny thing, the challenge of innovation. As our Chief Scientist, Ellen Finkel, will tell us, innovation is the key to Australia's economic competitiveness and growth. It requires, in large part, national proficiency in STEM. It will be driven by our higher education and research institutes' ability to generate breakthrough ideas and excellent STEM graduates. It'll be driven by the ability of these STEM graduates to translate breakthrough ideas into innovative products and services. The good news is that we're well into the implementation phase of the UK's Athena Swan pilot program in Australia, which, as you've heard, is led as a joint venture by the Australian Academy of Science and the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. Milestones to date include formation of SAGE in 2014 by Professors Brian Schmidt and Nalini Joshi, and Nalini is in the audience today, are working within the Academy of Science. The first SAGE forum was held in November 2014. The call for applications for the SAGE pilot, the first round, was finalised in June of 2015. The Academy of Technology and Engineering joined forces with the Academy of Science, and that was announced at the public launch of SAGE at Parliament House in September 2015. Institutional visits by the SAGE team began in the last quarter of 2015. The first biannual workshop supporting charter members were held in 2016, February, and the first quarterly regional networks meetings in March of 2016. The second call for applications was in May 2016. The progress has been rapid, you'll agree. And David Rubain will provide much more detail about Athena Swan in this presentation, but the decision was made very early on to bring Athena Swan to Australia, at least in pilot form. I'm not going to talk about the nuts and bolts of Athena Swan and what is the decoding of the acronym SWAN. I'll leave that to David. But I'd like to concentrate on why Athena Swan is distinct from other gender equity programs and why SAGE has adopted it. Athena Swan provides a rigorous collection, a process of data collection, evaluation and consultation with staff and students. It does not end with the identification of issues and existing programs that might exist in that organisation related to gender equity. Instead, the institutions must provide evidence of the gap between policies and practices through surveys, focus groups, interviews, and other evidence-based processes. Institutions must demonstrate in their Athena Swan Award application that they have undertaken and acted upon honest self-appraisal and self-reflection, starting with honest self-appraisal and self-reflection at the very top of the organisation. Another reason is that the process is transparent. All applications are made public, and it also yields a 4-year action plan, which David Rubain will explain to you in much more detail. To ensure integrity, rigour, and to assess how Athena Swan might boost productivity outcomes in the Australian STEM landscape, SAGE is going to commission an independent evaluation of the pilot, adapt the Athena Swan framework to the Australian context, focus on Australian-specific issues such as Indigenous Australians in STEM, tailor the process for the medical research institutes and publicly funded research agencies in Australia, as it was only in 2014 that research institutes were first included in the UK program. Use analytics on pooled data to design informed and evidence-based solutions. Identify issues that are common across institutions and require policy change across the sector. And through the peer review process, identify and document best practices that are shown to be working in STEM. So all of this, Athena Swan, SAGE, and the pilot in Australia are good news stories. The bad news that we need to reflect on is that gender discrimination in society is not necessarily intentional or overt, and is very hard to turn around at an individual level. The discrimination is unconscious and deeply ingrained in our societal psyche. The discrimination emerges in strange circumstances, and I'd like to just take one example, which is when women act in ways that aren't considered sufficiently feminine, or when women advocate for themselves. Men and women, in large part, unconsciously find these women unseemly, find them overly demanding, find them unlikable. I'd like to divert to the US for a moment, because we have a very good example in the US of this curse. I've been there for the last 3 weeks and have been studying how Hillary Clinton is suffering from this curse of unlikability. I've spoken to scholars both here in Australia, and they agree that it is largely because of her gender. As Rebecca Sheehan from the US Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where I've spent the last 6 years working, wrote in an op-ed recently, and I quote, "Clinton's ratings dropped significantly each time she sought political power through electoral office, whether running for US Senate or presidency. However, once she achieved positions of power, her approval ratings increased. As Secretary of State, she had an approval rating of 66%, a number that Obama himself has never reached, and was arguably the most respected politician in the US. Now, more than half the country can't stand her. The swings in opinion and their timing suggest that her apparent likability problem is not only or actually about her. Instead, it's more about a broader dislike of women who challenge the traditional gender order." End of quote. This isn't a new problem. The feminist Betty Friedan, whose 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, changed the lives of many women in the US and worldwide, framed it as the problem that has no name. And that's what we're really addressing today. In her just released book entitled What Works? Gender Equity by Design, Professor Iris Bonnet from Harvard University addresses head-on how such unconscious bias holds us all back, and how de-biasing individual people's minds has proven to be difficult, expensive, and ineffective. Her emphasis instead, as is that of Athena Swan, and this is a very important point to remember, is on de-biasing organisations instead of individuals. She demonstrates that taking this approach has great impact, often at surprisingly low cost and high speed. This is where the Athena Swan Charter and the SAGE pilot come to the fore. So today we are gathered not only to hear about Athena Swan and the SAGE pilot, we're gathered to call out, and more importantly, design out of our respective organisations this problem that has no name. The Athena Swan pilot will inform and drive gender equity by design. We must work together, men and women, to ensure that Australia's universities, research organisations and innovation system take advantage of our full talent pool. Thank you.
Talk about perfect timing. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Dr. Ellen Finkel, I'm sure is also very well known to you because he is the chief scientist of Australia. And he's also one of these people that does everything, so he's perfectly positioned to talk about these various linkages between academics, politics, and industry as well. So just to give you the bio sketch here, he's an entrepreneur, an engineer, a neuroscientist, and an educator. Again, he's now the chief scientist, and he has played a key role in striving for diversity and innovation. As a former president of the Australian Academy of Technologicals and Engineering of ATSE, Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, he spearheaded ATSE's partnership with the Academy of Science on the SAGE pilot. And to show that he's happy to live with diversity and responsibility within his own household, he is one of the power couples of Australia. His wife, Ellen Finkel, was also given a gong this year. She's an AO, so please welcome Ellen Finkel. And here's your clicker thingy.
I'm not doing PowerPoint.
Oh, somebody said you were doing a PowerPoint. Oh, David's back. Sorry.
No, Lee, thanks very much for the introduction. Just a few weeks ago, an email turned up in my inbox from Tim Dean. He's the science editor of the extraordinary website called The Conversation. And it was about a scandal that had blown up after my appointment was announced last October. Now, I don't like to see my name attached to any scandal, so I started to read the article, see what it was about, and I read it with great interest. So it turns out that back in October, and I'd missed it, Tim had put together a story that included a roundup of comments from senior figures in science, comments about my appointment. And it just so happens that every single one of the people that Tim reached out to and spoke to was a male. So I guess you'd have to say he failed the equivalent of the panel pledge that Elizabeth was telling us about this morning. So what happened was that a man, Tim, published an article about men talking about another man. And that last man just happened to be me, and it wasn't my fault. It was Tim's fault. He admits it. Because what he really was concerned about when he wrote the article just recently is that he hadn't noticed until people contacted him. And that was his point. If we don't notice, if we don't consciously commit to the goal of eliminating gender imbalance, then of course we perpetuate it. On the other hand, if we do notice, then ultimately we can work in a society in which we don't need to notice, because gender imbalance has gone into the dustbin of history, and that's where it belongs. So we're here today to notice, to reflect on what we have done well, and it's important not to be fixated on what we haven't achieved, but also to think about what we have achieved. We're here to reflect on what we need to do better, to work out what that means in practical terms, and most importantly, to commit to be held to account for what we achieve. And this is vital work. I say this personally and as chief scientist. I look to universities not just to reflect our society today, but to model the society that we want to be tomorrow. For 10 centuries, universities have been the drivers of social change. And frankly, if you don't agree with that statement, you're probably sitting in the wrong room. Fighting gender imbalance is not just in our interests, it ought to be in our institutional DNA. So, I refuse to give way to the tyranny of low expectations. When I look across the country, I want to see, on average, the same presence in management, the same presence in teaching and research positions, the same salaries across senior levels, and in every discipline, a shared understanding that diversity is strength. And on my reading of the evidence, we're not there yet. I know that Katrina will expand on this theme, but here are a few facts from the STEM Workforce Report published by my office this year. It draws on the latest available data from a comprehensive nationwide survey, a very comprehensive survey. It's known as the census. And the last one was in 2011. And at that time, of all the university graduates in STEM fields, fewer than 1 in 3 were female. 1 in 3 male STEM graduates was in the top income bracket, but only 1 in 6 women. Women made up more than half the early career researcher population, but fewer than 1 in 5 of our senior academics. Now that's just a snapshot in time. To understand it, we need to view it in context, because we are seeing progress, if not at the rate that we wish to see it. So there's been massive improvement since the late 1940s, when the brilliant radio astronomer Ruby Payne Scott had to conceal her marriage to keep her job at the CSIRO, and then had to retire because of the crime of pregnancy. But even in the last decade, there's been measurable progress. We know that overall the number of graduates is increasing, and against that background of growth, in the 5 years to 2011, the number of female STEM university graduates grew faster than the number of males. A 35% increase for women and a 29% increase for men. And just this week, our national press gave up its usual preoccupation with failure and catastrophe to celebrate the fact that the first female student has been selected for the Australian informatics team for the Science and Maths Olympiads. As Chief Scientist, I made a commitment when I started that I would celebrate great Australian achievements in every way that I can. And where I can, I celebrate Australian women in science, and I'm very proud to do so. But let me say clearly, celebrating progress does not mean settling for the status quo. 2011 is the baseline. When the 2016 census data becomes available, we will be able to read the trends. And in the meantime, we will continue to say to women that there are solutions, not just problems, in their path. So how do we accelerate change in ways that genuinely make a difference for women? Well, we're scientists and engineers. We ought to know how to set about solving a hard problem. First, you define it. Then you analyse it. Then you test it, you iterate, and then you scale up to national delivery. But we're also leaders and innovators in this room. So we know something about changing human behaviour as well. We need to commit to a goal, and we need to make that commitment wholeheartedly. We need to lead from the top. We need to explain what we're doing, and we need to be prepared to be held to account. And as we've just heard from Susan, Athena Swan takes exactly that approach. It makes incentives not just to clear the bar, but to clear it, to raise it, and set the ambition for others in turn. Athena Swan recognises that the challenge and the solution will not be the same in every university. It factors in the space to listen to women and learn from what works, and it could be things such as targeted grants and fellowships, or more allowance for career timeouts, hard recruitment targets, and a strong representation of women on selection panels, mentoring programs, many others. What we're looking for is directed evolution, and we're looking for that at national scale. The Australian Athena Swan pilot will allow us to take the same approach across the broader program framework. Now, from my personal experience, I know that we can change the culture if we try. Just take a look at the Academy of Technology and Engineering, ATSE, a body that represents some of the most stubbornly male-dominated disciplines in our sector. 5 years ago, we decided to take action. We set a hard target of a minimum 30% of new fellows to be female, and we have achieved that in every one of the last 5 years. And I can assure you as the former president, we did not in any way compromise quality to get to that point. We said we wouldn't compromise quality, and we didn't. We didn't have to. And the Academy is not stopping there. As we see in so many institutions, the more women on board, the more they shape the culture, and the faster we all progress. And whatever we do, we need to drive the process. We can't simply wait for generational change. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to both of our speakers for keeping in time, given that we started a little bit late. So our last speaker is Katrina Jackson, who I've known for a number of years wearing many hats, which is why I think of her as the ultimate knowledge broker, as they say in the game. She's had a career in media, government, strategic communications. She's been a senior advisor in federal parliament. Until recently was the CEO of the Science and Technology Australia. She's now making a move, and she's the incoming Deputy Chief Executive of Universities Australia, which is going to play an important role in the Swan program. So please welcome Katrina Jackson.
Excuse me while I wiggle my thing so it goes the right way around. Come on, wiggle the right way around.
That's the problem with
I'll just read this way. It's terrible, isn't it? Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Lee. What am I? An information broker.
Yeah, knowledge broker.
Sorry, a knowledge broker. As a knowledge broker, I understand the value of speaking concisely. Also, I live in mortal terror of that lemur down there, which also squeaks. Thank you, Alan, for being the token man on the panel. It's so nice to have you. I can't possibly compete with Susan. 9 female grandchildren. Gee, wow, I hope I get there. That's sensational. So sad that I didn't like the Barbies. As I was leaving the house this morning when it was still very dark in Canberra, my little girl, Stella, who's 8, asked why on earth I was going so early and what I was doing, and I said I was going to have a conversation with people about the fact that there weren't enough women at the top ranks in science. And I love the simplicity of little girls. She just said, that's not fair. And she's right. It's not fair. Simplicity of little girls also trusts that we can fix it. And for heaven's sake, surely we can. I mean, just the power of the people in this room, the example that's been set by David Rebane and his program, and the overwhelming response of public research and universities in this country to the pilot. I mean, I see Sue looking more and more nervous as she thinks, pilot? 40? 40 is a pilot? Goodness gracious me. I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Universities Australia is doing in this space. Please be kind to me. I've been 9 days in the job. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the stats. Not too much, I promise. I went to Monash University last year to talk about politics and how you interact with politicians. A very nice woman had organised the entire thing. I arrived there a little bit early. She welcomed me into her office. She had the drinks and the chips and the cheese for the nibblies afterwards. Her students all came down and collected the stuff. The forum went very well. They were very receptive. Her students obviously adored her and respected her absolutely enormously. Afterwards, we had dinner with the former chair of the department and a couple of students. It was an incredibly pleasant event, and she treated me extraordinarily well. She then saw the other two off, and then she drove me off to the cab rank. It was about 9:30 at night by that point. She had a baby set in the back of the car. We talked about professional things right up to that point. I asked her how she dealt with the balance between work and life and everything else. I don't think she really wanted to talk about it. I think she thought that maybe it was unprofessional to discuss those things when we'd had such a professional interaction up until that point. It was quite a long way to the cab rank, so I said that I'd had trouble managing it when I'd worked in politics and my little girls were very young, and then she let it all out. Her partner was a tradesman. She said she could not possibly have a partner who worked in academia because it would just be impossible to manage. She then went into extraordinary detail about how they just managed their day-to-day domestic life, how they just managed to make sure the baby was clothed and fed. You know, she apologised for the state of her car. She explained to me how she worked her life while keeping up her publications and keeping her students happy. My Monash friend is not an exception. We all know these stories. We all know these women who are working extraordinarily hard. It wasn't so much even the words. It wasn't even so much the story that she told me. It was the way she sounded. She was dog bone tired. Just that weariness that is not just a bad day or a bad week. It's that weariness that comes from having all the balls in the air, from thinking that if you just work harder, if you do 2 or 3 things at the same time all the time, you'll keep it all together. I see a number of women in the room who can hear that. We have to stop doing this to women. We just have to. I mean, we're tough, but, you know, enough is enough. So this is what this is about. Now I get to the, less I can just tell you stuff. So I agree with Ellen. Universities should, can and must be leaders in this space. I mean, we're a pretty intelligent group of people. We must set the standard in rational, evidence-based working out how to behave inside these great national institutions, research institutions like A.D. Patterson's, like the ARC, like all those institutions, as well as universities. If we can't do it, for heaven's sake, we can hardly lecture others about not being able to do it. You know the figures. Half science graduates at the start are women. So we start off really well. By the time we get to PhD, it's about 30-40%. By the time we get to senior leadership in universities, we're down to about a quarter. Only 10 of Australia's 39 Vice-Chancellors are women. If you look at the group of 8 universities, there's one woman, Margaret Gardner, the Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, so we have one. Aren't we doing well? Against that background, it's an absolute... if you look across the sector, it frankly doesn't get any better. So, I mean, not just STEM, but across all disciplines. We did some figures a little while ago. In the 4 years from 2010 to 2014, the number of women in senior roles in universities rocketed up from 23% to 25%. So that's 0.5% a year. I mean, even if we believe that rate of increase will be maintained, and all the studies indicate that it won't, we'll all be dead, and our daughters will be dead before there's any change significant at all. So for heaven's sake, now's the time. Against that background, it is such an enormous pleasure to see SAGE gathering such a head of steam and so many people involved. It's really important to understand this is, as has been already outlined and discussed, profound cultural change, so it won't be simple. Universities of Australia will stand with the Academy and with ATSI and all the institutions, all of our members, universities, in rising to this challenge. There are some things we're doing already, but we'll be sticking with you along the way because this is big. The reason we'll be sticking with you is we know this is the biggest game in town. Everyone in this room, and many for decades and decades before I came along, have been working tirelessly to make some change. This is the best chance we have, so let's grab it. The LEMA, I'm speeding up, the LEMA. The Universities of Australia Executive Women Group is led by 2 very impressive women, DVC Research at Southern Cross, Geraldine McKenzie, and Senior DVC at Swinburne, Janelle Kidd. This year they will launch, obviously with UA's assistance, a fresh plan to reach parity in the senior ranks inside a decade. Our board endorsed that figure last month. I really hope that's a big target. I really hope we can reach it. We certainly can't do it by ourselves. We'll produce a best practice guide for recruitment. We'll introduce more senior level mentoring and address unconscious bias, which is so important and so deeply ingrained in us, and I mean me, because it is just sitting there. You have to be reminded all the time. Thank you very much, Emma Johnston. We'll also be doing some figures in a space in which, frankly, the basic numbers aren't that great. We'll be making sure that everything we do dovetails, aligns exactly with what is being done in SAGE, because, gee, we don't need to expend any effort duplicating ourselves. As I said before, it's very important to understand this will be really hard. We're talking about very significant cultural change. If it was simple, we would have done it already, wouldn't we? I think we'll need to be resolute, we'll need to be patient, but not that patient. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions, so if you could raise your hands and our mic managers will get around to you. But while we're waiting for the gentleman on my left to ask his question, there's something I wanted to ask Susan. This is perhaps a technical, fiddly question, but my background is anthropology. And to me, there's, in anthropology circles, gender is a social role, sex is a biological role. Can you explain for us why we are talking about gender equity and not sex equity, or should we be talking about both?
Ooh, I think that's beyond my pay grade.
Oh, really? Anyone else care to make a dive at it? Would the use of the word gender or sex be a bit scary? I wonder. Anyway, do we have a microphone to our guest for a question? Yes.
Chris Tinney, Faculty of Science, UNSW. Katrina, your example, I think, of a woman having to keep all those balls in the air and do 2 jobs while being paid 80% of the salary of one job, I think is, to me, an example of one of the biggest problems we're having why we're seeing so little change, is that there is a powerful mind virus that permeates our society, which indicates that there is something unique about being a woman that predisposes you to doing unpaid work in the home and being the only person who's capable of caring for children. Having become a father myself, I realised that there are basically two things that I can't do in raising children, and that's gestate and lactate. Everything else I'm perfectly capable of doing. How can we change our societies so that the burdens of doing unpaid work and childcare are not solely falling on the women in our society?
You have 10 seconds to resolve this issue.
So, as Annabel Crabb said, she needed a wife. But you know what? She shouldn't have to need a wife. The last thing you want to do is deny people's instincts to live a decent life. I mean, we mustn't do that. We mustn't say it's just you can't look after your kids to a level that you think is all right. You can't ever be home for dinner. You know, you can't make sure you've got clean underpants. We mustn't make jobs so challenging that they're like that. And surely the part of the shift is there. I mean, I'm not going to weigh into who does the most vacuuming. I think we've probably worked out that it's, well, frankly, I pay someone to do my vacuuming because that's the way I sort it out. I pay someone to do my vacuuming, I pay someone to do the garden. So that, and making some compromises like that means that you can both have a very fruitful professional life, but I think this sort of, if we just took a whole bunch of things away from women, or they just decided that it was okay to have a messier kitchen, it would sort of be all right, or if you guys, just pulled your weight a bit more, it would kind of fix it. Well, you just have a very vigorous relationship with your husband. You just make it really bloody clear that they do
you wanted to make a comment add to this, and then Susan?
I want to make a quick comment. I think one of the important things to do is look for some best case examples, even if they're few and far between. Look for them and see what you can learn from them. So I'll give you a best case example that I came across at Monash University a couple of years ago. One of our senior professors of engineering, quite a young person, a woman, is well paid, at least as well as her peers, her male peers. And when she goes to conferences, through her grant and through a contribution from the university, because she had a young child, we paid for a nanny to go with her. Now, I know you can't do that easily or overnight for everybody, but if you have a best case example like that in mind, you've at least got something to aspire to.
Susan?
My comment is that it's better to have the institutions not regard people going home to do childcare or take care of domestic responsibilities penalised, and that applies to men and women. Holding the important institutional meetings after 5 p.m, that shouldn't happen. For many years I was at work by 6 a.m. and home by 5 p.m. The guillotine came down, I had to be home. I was penalised all those times because all of the meetings that were important to my progression, my position of influence in the institution took place after 5 o'clock, and I was therefore regarded as not committed. That applies to men as well who attempt to take up domestic responsibilities, and there are many of them, but we need to change the way our workflows operate.
There was a question in the back.
Thank you. Claire Braun from Women on Boards, and I've spent 10 or 12 years in this space too. I did quite a bit of work in Norway, and I always think it's fascinating that in that system, the two great things you do for your country, of course, you work and you have children, because you work to pay tax and you want to produce other little tax-paying units. And so therefore they are mutually inclusive, not mutually exclusive, which if you look at it from a business perspective makes a whole lot of sense. My question really relates to, we see quite a lot, we have quite a lot of women in academia and women in science in our network. And I constantly hear stories, particularly around things like the medical colleges and the way that women are treated, marginalised, basically how the power systems in those organisations quite often work against females, because when you look at the number of women specialists as well, if you're picking up the other M for this, that is a really key issue. And I'm also wondering if it's the academic system, which is based so much on things like tenure, the number of papers that you write, all of those kind of things, which implies a career progression that is sort of a lovely even ski slope, which of course for many women it's not. It's curly and it's sideways and it goes this way and it goes up and it kind of goes down. We we tend to have promotions that are based on those hierarchical sorts of systems. And I'm wondering if universities are looking to deconstruct that with a view, and those sort of medical colleges, with a view to thinking that in fact if we work on the structural elements, we will enable people to peak at the right times within their career and get the commensurate pay based on what they're contributing versus just where they happen to be at a particular age and stage.
Alan, would you like to tackle that as someone who's headed a university? How do we change the metrics so that women can progress in their career?
Well, I think there's been a lot of progress. So the biggest problem is probably the unconscious bias, because in the conscious effort, universities for many years now have given consideration to breaks in career. So it started off as a consideration for breaks for maternity leave and then paternity leave, but now it's been broadened out to most things. So if you are coming up for promotion and you happen to be 10 years post-PhD, you would normally, in a particular discipline, expected to have a certain average or above publication rate. But I think at all universities, but certainly the ones that I'm familiar with, if you've had a 4-year break in those 10 chronological years for, say, bringing up children, you'll be judged against the publication rate of somebody 6 years post-PhD. I would also say that, certainly at Monash, and I hope that at other universities, virtually every selection panel has a good number of women on it. We don't have selection panels that don't have, a decent large minority or a majority or equal numbers of women. And that's important too, because you need women looking at women to bring that alternative view, and also to remind us guys who've still got the unconscious bias that we are suffering from unconscious bias. So it's fantastic to have that. I'm sure that Aidan could speak to the fact that the ARC in its grant evaluation programs makes allowances for breaks in career or for circumstances related to something that might more often happen to women than men, causing some reason why you can't have the publication record that you would otherwise have. So in terms of the actual structural changes, I think a lot of them are there. Unconscious bias is big, but positive bias is there too. So I would say that every selection committee I've been on for years, there's an affirmative bias, gosh, let's hope that we can get a woman into this role, whether it's engineering or a vice-chancellor, whatever role. And because of the history of not as many women being in the pipeline, it's often difficult to do that, but the obvious bias is towards women, not against. So there are the problems that I think that we face are the unconscious bias problems that represent years of upbringing.
Well, and we're going to be talking about that in a later panel. So I think there's time for one more question over on my right.
Hello, thank you. Margaret Jollins from RMIT University Chemical Engineering. Alan, I have a question for you about the target where you changed the ATSE target of 30% women, so that's a fantastic outcome. But we heard from Elizabeth that these criteria, for example, have been designed by men for men. So I wonder what your thoughts were, in addition to a target, to changing the criteria and how to redesign them so that they're more encouraging to women.
So certainly that's not the only, well, going to the first part of your question, ATSE itself, that's not the only thing that ATSE does. So 30% was the highest target that we felt that we could consider at the time, because we are representing people from historically male-dominated industries. And so 30% when the pool out there is probably at the 10 to 15% is strong. But it's more than that. More or less half the governance board of ATSE is female. I think it's 50-50. And the CEO of ATSE is female. So we are leading by example. But then to the second part of your question, what to do about the pipeline of women coming into STEM and education. It's a huge challenge. And again, it's not for lack of trying, but it's very much a societal thing. It's the role models and encouraging women to see that it's possible, and then taking away the barriers to employment, working late, etc., etc. But it's very difficult because in many cases, say for example, startup companies, whether they're male employees or female employees, the culture in startup companies is not a question of going home at 5. In startup companies, it's 70 or 80 or 90 hours a week of work. 70 or 80 or 90 hours of work per week, because that is the nature of startup companies. And that can be very daunting, of course, to a young girl who's thinking about, children, etc. So there are very many complexities. I don't think anybody's got simple answers. Getting the data out there, which is what we've tried to do. Rosalind Princely from my office led the development of the STEM workforce report. This sort of data that Elizabeth Broderick was talking about, making it visible, raises awareness about opportunity and awareness about where the barriers are. But if we had any simple solutions, they would have already been in place, because it's at least 20 or 30 years now that deans of engineering, vice chancellors, managers of engineering companies have been trying to bring women in. Complex.
Yes, I was going to say we have time for final comments from Katrina and Susan.
Can I just respond to the question down the back briefly? I hear everything Alan's saying. We've all heard lots of suggestions about lots of solutions. The really fantastic thing about the SAGE project, and we've learnt from Athena, Swan, is that it's not about one university picking one thing they're going to do and then seeing a little bit of change. It's about a whole bunch of really useful incentives, and I hate to say the word competition, but competition between institutions about who can do best in the Athena Swan rankings, which will push up through institutions a whole bunch of change, a whole bunch of different initiatives, not just one time one woman is getting a childcare person to go with her to a conference, but incentive department by department, faculty by faculty, university, research institution by every other one of those to compete to do better, so that we want to work there. I mean, that's how we're going to get the kind of change that the lady down the back is talking about, and that's why I think this program is so important and why I'm so looking forward to hearing from David.
Susan.
I'd like to reiterate the point I made, that we are all very clever people, and we do accept in having tried everything else. It's a bit like democracy. What we need to do now is really sit back and design the system again, start all over again, which is what we're going to be doing through the Athena Swan program.
Well, thank you for the questions, and thank you, panelists.